The parade ground stretched wide under the morning sun, a vast rectangle of hardened earth and painted lines that seemed to glow in the heat. Soldiers stood in crisp formation, rifles gleaming at their sides, uniforms pressed so sharply they looked as though they had been carved from cloth and discipline. The faint smell of gun oil and boot polish hung in the air, mixing with dust kicked up by steady winds rolling in from the barren hills beyond the base. It wasn't an ordinary day. Inspections by generals were rare, and when they happened, the entire installation seemed to bend itself around the moment. Barracks had been scrubbed until every floor shone. Vehicles in the motor pool had been lined up like showroom displays, every hood wiped clean of grease. The soldiers knew the inspection wasn't just about order, it was about pride. It was about proving that even in distant corners of the world, far from Washington, the standards of the United States Army held strong. Sergeant Emily Carter shifted her weight slightly, just enough to ease the stiffness in her knees. She had been standing at attention for nearly an hour, waiting for the approach of the motorcade. Unlike some of the younger soldiers, she didn't fidget. She had stood for longer in harsher places nights, spent prone on freezing hillsides, eyes glued to a scope, breath measured in controlled silence. Compared to those moments, this was nothing. But even she couldn't deny the electric tension running through the formation. Her Barrett .50 caliber rifle rested on the table in front of her, polished until it reflected sunlight like a mirror. The weapon was massive, intimidating even in its stillness, a piece of machinery that looked less like a firearm and more like a declaration of power. Soldiers to her left and right occasionally stole glances at it. The Barrett had that effect on people. It wasn't a weapon most would ever fire in their careers. For Carter, though, it was familiar an extension of herself. She had carried it across mountains, hauled it through deserts, and trusted it in moments where everything came down to a single shot. Around her, the younger privates whispered nervously to themselves when they thought no one was listening. Some wondered aloud whether the general would stop to ask them questions, whether they might embarrass themselves with the wrong answer. A sergeant barked at them to quiet down, and silence fell again. The rhythmic thud of approaching boots was still absent, but everyone knew it was only minutes away. Carter's eyes flicked forward, focused but unblinking. She wasn't nervous. Not in the same way the others were. She had seen too much to be shaken by a general's presence. Still, she understood the weight of the moment. Inspections weren't just ceremonial. Careers could turn on a single exchange. The wrong tone, a sloppy salute, a missed detail, it could all end up in a report. And generals didn't forget. At the far end of the field, the first sound reached them. Engines rumbling, then cutting off. The motorcade had arrived. Soldiers straightened instinctively, as though a single invisible wire had tugged them all upright. The air grew tighter, heavier, the kind of atmosphere where even breathing felt like it might draw too much attention. A column of officers appeared, moving with precision. At their center walked the man everyone had been waiting for, the general. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate, medals glinting in the sun. His cap sat at a perfect angle, and his expression carried the weight of years spent in command. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence alone pressed down like gravity, pulling the attention of every eye on the field. He began walking the line. Each step was measured, deliberate, the stride of someone who had inspected hundreds of formations and knew the effect of silence better than words. Soldiers snapped salutes as he passed, their eyes fixed straight ahead. He gave only the slightest nods in return, his gaze flicking from rifles to faces, from boots to badges. When he reached the first squad, the general paused briefly, asking a question about maintenance procedures. His voice was calm, controlled, yet edged with the kind of authority that demanded perfection. The soldier stammered an answer, too quick, too nervous. A captain at the general's side scribbled something onto a clipboard. The line stiffened. Everyone understood. Mistakes would be remembered. Carter remained steady, her breathing controlled, her shoulders squared. The Barrett lay gleaming before her, a silent monument to the years she had carried it. Her mind didn't wander to fear. Instead, she thought of nights under starlit skies, her cheek pressed against cold steel, the world framed in her scope. She remembered the stillness before a shot, the way the world seemed to shrink to a single breath. Compared to those moments, this inspection felt small. Yet she knew it mattered in its own way. Recognition was rare in her world. Sometimes it came not from medals, but from the acknowledgement in a superior's eyes. The general moved closer. She could hear his boots now, sharp against the hardened ground. The line seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers saluted as he passed, each moment stretching longer than the last. Carter's grip on discipline never faltered, but inside she felt a quiet hum of anticipation. Would he notice her rifle? Would he even care? The Barrett was large enough to demand attention, its black frame dominating the table. Many assumed it would draw the general's interest, perhaps a question or a comment. But Carter knew better. To a man who had commanded battalions and seen battlefields across the globe, rifles were rifles, no matter how big. What mattered was the soldier behind them. Finally, the moment came. The general's boots stopped in front of her table. Carter raised her hand in salute, precise and sharp. His eyes flicked down to the Barrett, scanning it with the detached professionalism of a man who had seen 1,000 like it. For a heartbeat, he lingered. Then he moved on, his pace unbroken, his expression unchanged. To the watching soldiers, it seemed as though nothing had happened. Just another rifle, just another inspection. Carter lowered her salute, face impassive, her thoughts unreadable. She expected nothing more. The rifle was impressive, yes, but it wasn't new. What she carried on her chest, the badge that told of something extraordinary that was still waiting for its moment. For now, she stood in silence, a soldier among soldiers, her legacy hidden in plain sight. The general's presence carried like a weight, pressing on the air as he advanced down the long row of soldiers. His steps were deliberate, his pace unhurried, his boots striking the hardened ground with a rhythm that echoed across the field. Officers followed behind him like shadows, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning for the slightest imperfection. The formation stood rigid, every soldier locked in place, as though carved from stone. The inspection had taken on a cadence. He stopped briefly at each display, eyes scanning weapons, uniforms, and posture. A nod here, a sharp comment there. Soldiers held their breath until he moved on. When he passed, it felt like a release of tension, as though the weight of his gaze had lifted, leaving lungs free to draw air again. Sergeant Emily Carter knew that rhythm well. She had studied generals before, not in ceremonies, but in the after-action briefings where their decisions trickled down to squads like hers. Men like him carried reputations long before they ever stepped into sight. They were tacticians, commanders, and sometimes politicians, but always men whose gaze could change the course of a career. She understood that he was not here to marvel at rifles or boots. He was here to read the soldiers themselves. Still, there was no denying the silent pull of the weapon laid before her. The Barrett .50 was unlike the other rifles gleaming along the line. Its length stretched across the table like a blackened spine, steel and polymer forged into a weapon that seemed almost too heavy for display. Its massive scope gleamed in the sun, adjusted to perfection. To anyone with knowledge of weapons, it was more than a rifle. It was a statement of purpose, a machine built not for rapid fire, but for decisive impact. To Carter, the rifle was familiar, like an old comrade. She remembered the first time she carried it slung across her shoulder, the sheer weight, nearly breaking her stride. It was not a weapon for the faint-hearted. Every pound of its steel demanded endurance. Every shot demanded precision. It was not forgiving. Miss by an inch at 1,000 meters, and the bullet would miss by yards. Yet Carter had embraced it, mastered it, trusted it. It had been with her in deserts where the heat shimmered like liquid. It had lain beside her in mountains where frost bit into her skin. To her, the Barrett was less a weapon than an extension of her will. The general reached the display just before hers. He paused, asked a question about cleaning intervals, and the soldier stammered through an answer. Carter did not move, her gaze locked straight ahead. Her fingers rested at her side, steady, betraying none of the tension humming in her chest. The general nodded curtly, then shifted his boots forward. The echo of each step grew louder until finally he stood before her. For a fleeting moment, his eyes dropped to the Barrett. They scanned its lines with clinical precision, noting the spotless barrel, the gleaming scope, the stock polished to perfection. To him, perhaps, it was another rifle, nothing more. He had seen thousands like it on bases, in war zones, in briefings where maps stretched across tables and weaponry was little more than a column in logistics reports. He did not pause. He did not bend down. His expression did not change. With the same measured pace, he continued forward, leaving the Barrett behind as though it were no more remarkable than the boots beneath her feet. The soldiers around her seemed to exhale in unison. Some had expected the rifle to command attention, to warrant at least a comment. But the general had given none. His stride did not falter. His silence said everything. Rifles, no matter how large or fearsome, were only tools. Tools were only as significant as the hands that carried them. Carter's face did not flicker. Her eyes remained forward, her posture precise. But inside, a faint flicker of thought stirred. She knew the rifle was not what mattered, not today. It was the badge on her chest, barely larger than a coin, that carried the weight of a story no rifle could tell. Still, she couldn't help but remember the way soldiers, even seasoned ones, reacted to the Barrett. She had seen the awe in their eyes the first time they held its weight, the reverence in their voices when they squeezed the trigger and felt the recoil slam against their shoulders. To them, it was a beast, an untamed thing. To her, it was simply a partner. She recalled nights lying prone with the rifle balanced before her, waiting for hours in silence, heart sinking with the tick of the scope's adjustments. She thought of the shot that had carved her name into legend, though few knew it, the shot that stretched farther than most could even fathom, across a valley where wind gusted like a living thing. Yet none of that showed on her face. A soldier did not wear their stories in their expressions. They wore them in silence, in discipline, in the quiet dignity of service. So she stood unmoving as the general's boots marched on, as though the Barrett had never been there at all. For the younger soldiers nearby, it was a strange moment. They had expected the rifle to matter more than it did. They whispered later that perhaps the general had missed it, or perhaps he had seen too many to care. Some even wondered if it was a test, if ignoring the Barrett was meant to see whether Carter herself would flinch, or break discipline, or betray the pride she might feel in displaying such a weapon. But she had not moved, not even a fraction. Her stillness spoke louder than any reaction could. The Barrett gleamed on the table, sunlight sliding along its barrel like liquid fire. To anyone else, it was an impressive machine. To the general, it was only steel. To Carter, it was memory, sweat, sacrifice. But in that moment, as his boots carried him farther down the line, the rifle faded into the background. What remained, waiting quietly on her chest, was a different symbol entirely. A story condensed into a badge. A shot that had reached across impossible distance. A history hidden behind silence. The Barrett had not caught the general's attention, but something else soon would. The general's boots echoed faintly behind her now, his stride carrying him farther down the formation. To the soldiers standing nearby, the inspection went on as usual. But for Sergeant Emily Carter, the moment stirred memories she could never quite silence. The Barrett may not have drawn the general's eye, but her story was not written in polished steel. It was written in a single shot, taken years before, in a place where the world narrowed to crosshairs and breath. That story began in mountains half a world away. The air there had been thin, biting, and cruel. Even in daylight, cold winds scraped across jagged ridgelines, carrying sand and grit that clung to skin and tore at eyes. Carter had lain prone on a rocky slope, her body pressed against unforgiving stone, wrapped in camouflage that barely dulled the sting of the wind. Hours had passed, and she had barely moved, save for the minute adjustments of her fingers on the scope and trigger. Her cheek rested against cold metal, her breathing measured in fractions. The mission was simple on paper: eliminate a high-value target before his convoy reached the valley road. In practice, it was anything but simple. The target would appear briefly in a clearing far below, flanked by guards and shielded by distance most snipers would never dare attempt. 3,200 meters. Nearly 2 miles. Beyond the effective range of most rifles, and certainly beyond what most soldiers would ever attempt under combat conditions. Her spotter, Corporal Davis, crouched beside her, eyes pressed to his binoculars. He had been with her long enough to know when to speak and when silence mattered more. For hours he had said nothing, letting the valley unfold below them like a slow-moving chessboard. Finally, he whispered, "Convoy, 1 click out." Carter didn't shift. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, not yet inside. She adjusted her scope, recalculating distances, scanning for wind breaks, watching how the dust swirled near the rocks below. The valley played tricks on bullets. Air currents shifted unexpectedly, carrying projectiles astray like leaves in a storm. At this range, even the Earth's rotation came into play. She had calculated it all, again and again, scribbling notes in the small weathered pad tucked into her vest. The convoy appeared dust plumes first, then vehicles grinding along the dirt road, sunlight flashing off windshields. Her pulse slowed. She had trained herself to enter a different state, one where nerves gave way to clarity. The world shrank to numbers, adjustments, the invisible math that turned chaos into precision. "Targets in the second vehicle," Davis murmured. She shifted her scope, settling the crosshairs just ahead of the convoy's slow crawl. The man they were waiting for would step out at the checkpoint ahead, confident in the protection of his guards. He had no reason to fear a rifle so far away, it might as well have been invisible. Carter inhaled slowly, deeply. The breath steadied her. She adjusted elevation, corrected for wind, dialed the scope in micro-movements so small most wouldn't notice them. Her world narrowed further, until all she saw was the checkpoint. The vehicles halted. Doors opened. Men spilled out, rifles slung, eyes scanning lazily. Then he appeared the target. He carried himself with arrogance, a swagger built from years of unchecked power. He stepped into the clearing, surrounded by guards. Davis whispered coordinates. Carter barely heard him. Her mind was already running calculations, playing the shot forward in her head, seeing the bullet arc across air like a line of fate. 3,200 meters. Gravity would drag the round down in a long, curving fall. Wind would push it sideways, twisting its path. The Coriolis effect would nudge it further still, the Earth itself tugging at the bullet's journey. She had factored all of it. She trusted her math. She trusted her rifle. She trusted herself. Her finger slid inside the trigger guard. Pressure built slowly, evenly. Not a squeeze, not a jerk, but a steady press as natural as breathing. The rifle thundered. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she barely felt it. The sound cracked across the mountain, echoing like thunder. The bullet tore free, spinning faster than the eye could comprehend, carving its way into the invisible chaos of the valley. Seconds passed. At that range, the shot was not instant. The bullet traveled, unseen, while Carter held her breath, eyes locked through the scope. And then, impact. The target staggered. A bloom of crimson. Guards spun, shouting, chaos exploding in the clearing. But the man at the center had already fallen, lifeless, a hole torn where arrogance had once lived. Davis let out the breath he had been holding. "Jesus," he whispered, awe slipping into his voice. "You hit it." Carter didn't smile. She didn't move. She only watched through the scope as the convoy scrambled, men shouting, firing blindly into empty hillsides where no enemy could be seen. Her heartbeat was steady. Her mind was calm. She had made the shot. It was not luck. It was not chance. It was discipline, patience, calculation. It was the culmination of years spent training her body to endure, her mind to focus, her hands to trust in numbers. She knew then, with certainty, that this shot would be remembered not openly, perhaps, but in the quiet way soldiers remembered the impossible. Later, when they exfiltrated under nightfall, Davis kept shaking his head. 3,200 meters. "Nobody's going to believe it." "Doesn't matter if they believe it," she had replied quietly, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "What matters is that it counted, and it had counted." The mission report would list the target neutralized, operation successful. The details of how, of distance, of impossibility, would vanish into classified files. The world outside would never know. But her unit knew. Davis knew. And Carter herself carried the memory like a scar, invisible yet indelible. Years later, standing on the parade ground with the sun blazing overhead, and her Barrett polished for inspection, that memory lived with her still. It was stitched onto her chest in the form of a small badge, one most soldiers barely glanced at. Few understood its weight. Fewer still knew the story behind it. The general had passed her Barrett without pause, but Carter knew the rifle was only part of her history. The real story was in that single shot, taken from a distance most called impossible, executed with calm precision that even now she struggled to explain. Her eyes remained forward, her posture unbroken, but inside she carried the weight of that hidden story. A story not told in parades or briefings. A story that lived only in silence, waiting for the rare moment when someone might stop, look closer, and truly see. The general's footsteps grew fainter as he moved farther down the line, yet the silence in Sergeant Emily Carter's chest was louder than the rifles on display. She held her stance, eyes fixed forward, shoulders locked, her discipline unbroken. On the surface, nothing had changed. The inspection went on as though she were another soldier in another row, her Barrett forgotten like so many rifles before it. But inside, Carter felt the familiar echo of her career's greatest truth. Recognition never came easily. From her first day in uniform, she had learned that acknowledgement in the Army was uneven. Some accomplishments lit up the sky with medals, press conferences, and promotions. Others disappeared into after-action reports, buried under classified stamps, and filed into steel cabinets where no one but a handful of officers would ever read them. For Carter, most of her career had belonged to the latter category. She remembered her first deployment, young and determined, carrying her rifle through hostile villages where every shadow could hide danger. She remembered being commended quietly by her squad leader after a successful mission, only to watch as official credit traveled upward, delivered to ranks that had not shared the mud, the hunger, or the risk. That was the nature of the job. Wins belonged to the team. Losses were owned by everyone. An individual sacrifice dissolved into the larger story of the unit. When she had taken the shot that would define her, Carter had known even then it would vanish behind classified walls. The kill at 3,200 meters was too unusual, too extraordinary, to be shared openly. Her commanders had praised her efficiency, her composure, her precision, but only in rooms where walls held secrets. To the outside world, the operation was merely successful. There were no front-page headlines, no citations in newspapers, no speeches about her marksmanship. Only a few words added to her file, locked away. And yet, she had not cared, not entirely. Carter had not joined the army for medals or glory. She had joined for discipline, for purpose, for the chance to protect those who stood beside her. Every mission was about ensuring that her unit came home alive. That was her reward, seeing her team climb into the extraction bird, every seat filled, every face accounted for. Still, the Army had a way of reminding soldiers of their invisibility. Recognition mattered in ways she could not deny. Medals opened doors to promotions. Citations shifted careers. The difference between being seen and being overlooked could determine the trajectory of an entire life. She had felt it during evaluations, when officers glanced at her file, saw the neat line of successful missions, and nodded without looking deeper. They didn't see the freezing nights, the silence before impossible shots, the nerves she had mastered into calm. They saw numbers. They saw statistics. They saw only what was written, not what was lived. Her sniper badge had been one of the few tangible acknowledgments she carried. Small, understated, it said more in its silence than any ribbon could. Those who knew, truly knew. A badge earned at that distance told its own story, whispered between soldiers who understood the near impossible. But for most who saw it pinned to her chest, it was simply another patch. Something to glance at, nod politely, and move on. Carter had made peace with that mostly. She had trained herself not to expect applause. She had watched other soldiers chase medals like lifelines, seen the disappointment when recognition never came. She had told herself she would not be like that. Her worth wasn't defined by who noticed. Her worth was in knowing she had done her job with precision, with discipline, with honor. And yet, she was human. She could not deny the small part of her that longed, even briefly, to be seen, to be acknowledged not in whispers, not in closed rooms, but openly, publicly, in the eyes of someone whose respect carried weight. Not because she wanted glory, but because acknowledgement affirmed sacrifice. It meant her story mattered beyond herself. The inspection continued, but Carter's mind lingered on the years behind her. She thought of missions in villages, where the line between friend and enemy blurred, of long marshes where her shoulders ached from the Barrett's crushing weight, of nights where exhaustion begged her to sleep, but duty demanded vigilance. None of those nights had medals attached. They were simply memories hard, unglamorous, and unrecorded. Recognition, she knew, was delayed for most soldiers. Sometimes it never arrived at all. Some men and women carried their legacies only in scars, in aches that followed them into old age, in stories whispered to their children, long after the uniform was hung up. Carter had always assumed hers would be the same. Quiet, unremarked, a history lived in silence. As she stood on the parade ground, sun blazing, sweat beading under her collar, she reminded herself of that truth. Today would be no different. The general would pass. He might nod, he might not. Her Barrett might draw a glance, or it might fade like the countless rifles he had seen before. Her badge, her story, would remain invisible. She accepted that with the same calm she had carried on mountaintops and in valleys. Discipline meant not chasing acknowledgement. Discipline meant standing tall, even when unseen. Yet even as she reminded herself, something deep inside stirred. A question she rarely allowed herself to ask. What if, just once, someone looked closer? What if the silence broke? She pushed the thought away, returning to stillness. Expectation was dangerous. Hope was heavier than any rifle. Better to stand ready, steady, unshaken. Better to let the moment pass as all others had before it. The general's voice drifted faintly back toward her as he questioned another soldier down the line. Carter's eyes stayed fixed forward. She knew better than to watch. Her job now was simple. Hold her position, keep her discipline, represent her unit with quiet strength. Recognition could wait. Recognition might never come. But she would remain steady, as she always had. The Barrett gleamed on the table before her, sunlight sliding across its steel. The badge sat silent on her chest, unnoticed, unremarked. For now. The cadence of the general's boots rolled across the formation like a drumbeat. He had passed soldier after soldier, his gaze sharp, his presence heavy. For most, his inspection lasted only seconds, just long enough to glance at a rifle, a uniform, a salute, before moving on. To the soldiers, those seconds felt like hours. To the general, they were routine. Sergeant Emily Carter expected the same. He had already passed her Barrett without hesitation, his eyes gliding over the massive rifle as if it were just another piece of steel. She assumed he would march on, leaving her as invisible as always. But then he stopped. The sound of boots ceased. The silence that followed was louder than any order. Every soldier in earshot felt it instantly, as though time itself had stumbled. Soldiers farther down the line adjusted nervously, unsure why the rhythm had broken. Officers glanced up from their clipboards. Even the wind seemed to quiet, as if the air itself leaned in to listen. Carter stood motionless, her eyes locked forward, but her pulse thudded hard against her ribs. She had learned long ago never to let nerves show. Her training had drilled it into her. Steady under fire, steady under pressure, steady under inspection. And yet, as the general's shadow stretched across her, she felt the weight of his attention settle on her chest. Not on the Barrett. Not on her boots. On the badge. The general's eyes had caught the small insignia stitched neatly above her pocket. To most, it looked like nothing more than a token of service, a detail to be overlooked. But to those who understood, it was more than fabric and thread. It was a story, a distance, a record carved not in parades, but in silence and wind and steel. He leaned slightly closer, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on the badge. He did not speak. He did not move on. He simply stared. The seconds stretched. Soldiers shifted almost imperceptibly, though none dared break formation. The pause grew heavier, charged with a tension that prickled skin and tightened throats. Everyone nearby knew something unusual was happening. Generals did not stop for long. Generals did not linger. And yet here he was, halted in his stride, his attention anchored by a mark so small it could be missed at a glance. Carter felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she did not falter. Her chin remained high, her eyes forward, her shoulders locked. Inside, though, her mind raced. Was he reading it correctly? Did he understand what it meant? Did he know the distance? The numbers? The impossibility. The general had commanded units across continents. He had read reports most soldiers would never glimpse, studied operations stamped, top secret, and locked away. If anyone could read the story behind her badge, it was him. And perhaps she realized he had. The pause was not an accident. It was recognition. Still, he did not speak. His silence grew heavier by the second, pulling at every soldier in range. They could feel the gravity of his gaze, even if they did not understand what he was seeing. To them, it was only a badge. To him, to Carter, it was something else entirely. Carter thought of the night she earned it. The cold mountains. The long wait. The impossible shot. She remembered the moment of impact, the silence after, the way Davis had whispered in disbelief. She had carried that memory like a hidden flame ever since, tucked behind discipline and duty. No one beyond her unit had truly acknowledged it. Until now. Her heart hammered once hard, then steadied. She reminded herself, hold your stance. Do not break. Recognition, if it came, was not to be sought. It was to be received with the same discipline as silence. The general's jaw tightened slightly, his expression unreadable. He had the look of a man weighing not the rifle before him, nor the soldier's posture, but something deeper, something carried in the small, quiet symbol on her chest. Finally, he straightened. His eyes lingered one moment longer, then flicked to hers. For the briefest heartbeat, Carter thought she saw something in his gaze, a flash of respect, of acknowledgement rarely given, never spoken lightly. A pause broke. The sound of boots resumed, echoing down the line as the general continued his inspection. To the soldiers watching, it was over. Just a moment, nothing more. But to Carter, it was everything. Because in that pause, in that silence, her story had been seen. She remained motionless, her posture unbroken, her expression steady. Yet inside, she felt the ripple of something she had not allowed herself to feel in years, the weight of recognition, the validation of being understood. Not by a medal, not by a headline, but by a glance, a pause, from a man who knew what it meant. The soldiers around her would whisper later. They would wonder why he had stopped, why he had lingered. Some would guess it was about her rifle. Others might think he had seen an imperfection. Few would realize the truth. Carter did not need them to. The badge spoke for itself. The pause had given it a voice. And though no words had been spoken yet, the silence carried further than sound. The general's boots struck the pavement again, echoing down the line as though nothing unusual had happened. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked routine. A simple pause, a moment of hesitation before continuing the inspection. Yet for those close enough to feel it, the silence he had left behind clung to the air like smoke. Sergeant Emily Carter stood motionless, every muscle still bound to discipline. But inside her chest, the pause reverberated. Soldiers lived through thousands of inspections. Generals came and went, their gazes as fleeting as shadows. But a pause of that length, a silence charged with intent, was not routine. It was deliberate. The soldiers to her left and right had noticed. She could feel it in the stiffened shoulders, in the subtle quickness of their breathing. None would dare whisper, not yet, but each of them carried the question in their minds. Why her? Why stop here? Carter knew the answer, though she did not allow herself to embrace it fully. Discipline demanded restraint. Recognition, if it existed, had to be met with stillness. And yet, she felt the heat of it settling into her bones, the weight of respect carried not in words, not in medals, but in the simplest, rarest of gestures. Silence. The army was a place of noise. Orders shouted, radios crackling, rifles firing. Even in rest, there was chatter, banter, the hum of 100 men and women pushing through long days. Silence was rare, and when it came, it carried meaning. That pause, the general's pause, was louder than a speech. It told her that someone, at the highest level, had seen her. Not her file, not the neat rows of missions written in detached language, but her. The soldier, the sniper, the story etched into a badge most overlooked. She remembered moments from her past, when silence had meant everything. The silence after the shot at 3,200 meters, when the target dropped and the mountains seemed to hold their breath. The silence in the helicopter after extraction, her teammates too stunned to speak, each glance at her filled with disbelief and gratitude. The silence in the dark of tents, when exhaustion pressed heavy and all that mattered was survival. Now, that same silence had found her again, this time on a parade ground under a general's gaze. It carried no sound, but it roared with meaning. Carter did not move. Her posture was perfect, her expression steady. Yet behind the mask of discipline, she let herself feel it. Just enough. The rare warmth of respect settling quietly where recognition had long been absent. The inspection carried on, boots clapping farther down the line. The formation held. Officers scribbled notes. The world resumed its rhythm, but for Carter, time seemed split before the pause and after it. Before, she had been another soldier in the line. After, she was something else. Not elevated above her comrades, not placed on a pedestal, but seen. Simply seen. And for someone who had lived most of her career in shadows, that was no small thing. She thought of her father, who had served before her. He had once told her that the army rarely said, "Thank you," the way civilians imagined. Gratitude here was subtle, coded, often unspoken. It lived in the trust between teammates, in the nod of an officer who had no words, in the steady hand on your shoulder before a dangerous mission. Respect was never cheap, never loud. It was silent, and when it came, it carried the weight of truth. This was that kind of respect. The general's silence had spoken louder than applause. His pause had honored her without fanfare. In that still moment, he had told her, "I know. I see you. I understand what you carry." That mattered more than ceremony. Her thoughts flickered to the younger soldiers in formation, fresh faces with bright eyes, still chasing medals and commendations. They might not yet understand the value of silence, of quiet acknowledgement, but they would in time. They would learn that true respect was often invisible, living not in the noise of parades, but in the quiet recognition of those who truly knew what sacrifice meant. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher. Sweat gathered beneath her collar, yet Carter did not shift. She remained steady, letting the discipline carry her body while her mind lingered on the moment. She realized that this was what she had been waiting for, not consciously, but deep down, beneath layers of duty and silence. She had never needed medals. She had never needed newspapers. She had needed this. A moment where her story, hidden in classified files and unspoken memories, was recognized by someone who understood. It would not change her record. It would not appear in her file. Tomorrow, the inspection would be a line item in her report. But she would remember the pause. She would carry it with her into every mission, every march, every long night. It was enough. As the general's voice carried faintly from down the line, questioning another soldier, Carter's chest settled. The pounding of her heart eased. She let discipline guide her breathing, slow and steady, the way she had on rooftops and ridgelines. Calm, controlled, ready. She thought of how silence had shaped her, how it had been her companion in the field, her shield in moments of fear, her weapon when patience mattered more than bullets. And now, it had become her recognition. The irony was not lost on her. The sniper, master of silence, honored by silence. A faint breeze moved across the formation, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and oil from the rifles. The world carried on. Soldiers blinked in the sun. Officers shifted papers. The general's inspection neared its end. Yet for Carter, everything had already changed. Not in ways others would see. Not in ways that would be written. But in the quietest, truest way possible. Respect had found her not in applause, but in stillness. The general's voice carried steadily as he moved farther down the line, his questions sharp, his tone measured. The soldiers answered quickly, nervous but disciplined. The inspection appeared to be back on track, routine once more. To most, The pause at Sergeant Emily Carter's position would already be fading from memory. But not for her. She remained as still as stone, her discipline unbroken, but inside she felt the aftershocks of the moment he had stopped at her badge. Respect and silence had been enough more than she had expected, more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. She could have carried that with her forever. And then, unexpectedly, the boots stopped again. This time, the silence was sharper. The general had completed the line, his aides trailing him with clipboards tucked under arms. Officers expected him to dismiss the formation. Instead, he turned. His steps retraced, purposeful and deliberate, back toward Carter. The soldiers sensed it instantly. The line stiffened as though struck by lightning. Heads remained forward, eyes locked ahead, but every heartbeat along the formation seemed to sync to the rhythm of his returning steps. Generals did not backtrack. Generals did not turn around. And yet, here he was walking directly back to her. Carter felt her pulse climb again, hammering harder than she would ever admit. Her eyes stayed forward, her chin high, her body steady. Discipline was her armor. But her thoughts raced. Why? The boots stopped in front of her. For the second time that morning, silence descended. But this silence was different. The first had been quiet recognition, unspoken respect. This one was heavier, charged with expectation. It demanded words. The general stood tall before her, hands clasped lightly behind his back. His eyes scanned her rifle, her posture, then rose to the small badge on her chest. His gaze lingered, and finally met her eyes. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying enough weight to anchor the entire formation. 3,200 meters. The words struck like a bullet. Not shouted, not asked. Stated. A fact. A recognition. Carter's training held her still, but the words reverberated through her like thunder. He knew, not just the badge, not just the implication. He knew the number, the shot, the impossible distance. Her throat tightened. She had endured missions, firefights, impossible nights without faltering, but in that moment she felt the full gravity of being seen. She answered as discipline demanded, her voice firm, unwavering. Yes, sir. The general's gaze stayed fixed on her. His silence stretched again, but this time it was not empty. It was filled with weight, with meaning, with the unsaid recognition of what that distance meant. The calculation, the patience, the impossible precision, and the courage it demanded. He spoke again, his words slower now, deliberate. I've read the report. No one else in the line breathed. The formation was still, but every soldier felt the charge of his words. Reports at that level were buried, guarded, rarely mentioned aloud. For him to say it here, in front of the unit, was not routine. It was extraordinary. Carter steadied her breath, her voice calm. Yes, sir. The general tilted his head slightly, studying her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp. Then, after a moment, he gave a single, slight nod. Outstanding work, Sergeant. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any medal pinned in a ceremony. They were not the generic praise of a commander passing by. They were precise, targeted, intentional. They acknowledged the story behind the badge. They made her invisible history visible. A ripple of awareness moved through the line. The soldiers did not move, did not speak, but they had heard. They would carry the memory of this moment long after the inspection ended. Carter's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and humility. She had told herself for years that she did not need acknowledgement. And yet, these words, so few, so direct, sank into her deeper than she could have imagined. She answered firmly, her tone steady. Thank you, sir. The general's gaze lingered on her for one more heartbeat. Then he stepped back, his posture still crisp. His voice rose, projecting to the entire formation. This soldier carries a record most of you can barely imagine. Remember it. Respect it. The words cut through the air like a command, sharp and clear. They were not just for her. They were for everyone standing in that sunlit formation. For Carter, it was almost too much. She had lived in silence for so long, her accomplishments hidden, her sacrifices unremarked. To hear them acknowledged, openly, by a general in front of her peers, was like stepping from shadow into sunlight. The general gave one last nod, then turned sharply on his heel. His boots struck the ground, resuming their rhythm, this time leading him away for good. The inspection concluded. Orders were given. The formation began to break. But Carter remained rooted in that moment. The words echoed in her mind, simple, unembellished, but carrying the full weight of recognition. 3,200 meters. It was not a medal. It was not a headline. But it was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Respect, finally spoken. The parade ground emptied slowly, boots scuffing against hot pavement as the soldiers dispersed. Orders barked by lieutenants carried the usual authority, but everyone in the formation still carried the weight of what they had just witnessed. The inspection had ended, but its memory would linger. Soldiers traded quick, wordless glances as they marched away, each of them silently replaying the moment the general had stopped, turned back, and spoken. Sergeant Emily Carter moved with her unit, her stride steady, her posture composed. Outwardly, she was no different than before another soldier following routine. But inside, she carried something that changed everything. For years, she had told herself recognition was unnecessary. That silence was enough. That her worth was measured in discipline, not applause. She had learned to bury her desire for acknowledgement deep, to let it sleep beneath layers of composure. But today, that silence had been broken. And in the breaking, it had reshaped her. The general's words were still sharp in her memory. 3,200 meters. He had spoken her story aloud, not in secret reports or classified files, but in front of her peers. In that moment, her years of quiet sacrifice had been pulled into the light. Not glorified. Not exaggerated. Simply seen. That was all she had ever wanted. As her unit moved toward the barracks, Carter's fellow soldiers stole glances at her. They had always respected her discipline, her calm under pressure, but now they saw something more. The general's acknowledgement had reframed her in their eyes. She was no longer just Sergeant Carter, reliable and steady. She was the sniper who had done the impossible and been recognized for it. No one said it aloud. They didn't need to. Soldiers understood the value of silence. But in their nods, in the steadiness of their gazes, Carter felt the respect deepen. Later that evening, when the sun dipped low and the base settled into its usual rhythm, Carter sat alone on the barrack steps, her Barrett cleaned and stored, her badge still pinned to her chest. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of oil and dust. Around her, the base hummed with ordinary life soldiers laughing, radios playing faintly, engines growling in the distance. She thought back over her career, the early days when she was still learning the patience of the scope, the long deployments where each sunrise blurred into the next, the frozen nights on mountainsides where silence was her only companion. She thought of the faces of her unit, men and women she had protected, some she had lost, others who had gone home because she had not missed. All of it, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, every shot had led to this day. She smiled faintly, not with pride, but with peace. For the first time, she felt her journey acknowledged in a way that mattered. Not through ceremony, not through empty speeches, but through the simple, heavy truth of a general's words. And yet, she knew this moment was not just for her. It belonged to her unit, to every soldier who had carried her through those impossible missions. It belonged to Davis, who had whispered disbelief that night in the mountains. It belonged to every sniper who had ever waited in silence, every soldier whose story lived in shadows. Carter realized then that her legacy was not about the number 3,200 meters or the record it represented. Her legacy was about silence itself, about the discipline to wait, about the strength to carry recognition quietly, without demand, about proving that greatness could live unseen until the moment it was finally, briefly, revealed. As the evening deepened, a young private approached her hesitantly. He stood stiffly, hands behind his back, nervous but determined. "Sergeant," he said, voice respectful. Carter looked up, her expression calm. "Private," the soldier swallowed, then nodded toward her chest. "Is it true, what the general said?" For a moment, she considered deflecting, keeping it buried as she always had. But the private's wide eyes reminded her of herself, years ago, hungry for direction, for proof that impossible standards could be met. "It's true," she said simply. The private's face shifted half disbelief, half awe. He nodded once, sharply, then straightened. "That's incredible, Sergeant. Inspiring." Carter gave him a steady look, her tone firm but kind. "It wasn't about glory. It was about protecting my team. Remember that. Records don't matter. People do." The private nodded again, his expression serious now. "Yes, Sergeant." As he left, Carter felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. This was her legacy, not just the record, not just the badge, but the example she set for those who came after. If one soldier carried her lesson forward, then the pause, the words, the recognition, it had all been worth it. Night fell, stars cutting sharp patterns across the sky. Carter sat a little longer, her thoughts calm. She knew her name would never be in newspapers, her face never on magazine covers. That was fine. She did not need the world to know. She had the silence. She had the badge. She had the memory of a general who had paused, then spoken. That was enough. And in the quiet, under the vast American sky, Sergeant Emily Carter understood her legacy. It was not noise. It was silence.